Welcome to the Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to have you here. As most of you in this room know, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the official living memorial to our nation's 28th president. It's the idea of this memorial is not just to create a static building in marble and stone, but rather to create a place where the world's best and brightest scholars on international affairs can come together. The work that these scholars produce here at the center and also around the world is really what marks us out as an extraordinary and unique institution. This event gives me special pleasure today for a number of reasons. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I have been lucky enough to work with Dolia Esteves, the author of this book, for a number of years. When I first moved to Mexico, I was introduced to her back in 1996 as a Mexican. Yes, I know it's been a long time, Dolia. I'm sorry. As a highly unusual Mexican journalist who was interested in actually playing a role in the bilateral relationship, who really understood the United States. And in those days, there weren't many of them around, I have to say. I've had the opportunity to work with Dolia on a number of projects in my academic role when I was in Mexico, and now it's fantastic to be able to work with her on this project here. The presentation of her book, U.S. Ambassadors to Mexico, The Relationship Through Their Eyes, is a unique opportunity to get insights into the historical record, or really rather to establish the historical record. The ambassadors that we have here with us today cover a period of U.S.-Mexico relations from 1989 to 2002, a period of incredible deepening of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. It's tough for us to think back before the NAFTA and to think what were things like back then. And when Ambassador Negroponte arrived in 1989 in Mexico City, the possibilities of actually pulling that agreement together still seemed like it was going to be a long and difficult road, both on the bilateral or trilateral negotiations front, and also, of course, in terms of domestic politics. The U.S. and Mexico and Canada pulled that off. We then moved forward into a new period of relations in the North American region. Ambassador Jones came in to take over the mantle of guiding that relationship from Mexico City, and saw it through an extraordinary period from 1993 through to the late 90s. And at that point, I had actually just arrived in Mexico City, and although I didn't get the chance to meet you, Ambassador, I heard about you from my colleagues, and in particular from my boss in those days, Rafael Fernandez de Castro. And then I was lucky enough to meet Ambassador Davidal when he came in. And Ambassador Davidal was always incredibly kind with me, recognizing me as a newbie in Mexico and giving me the benefit of his knowledge and experience. Ambassador Davidal also helped me later on to establish my own line of research on Mexican energy issues. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. One of the things that particularly excites me about this project, and the reason why I think it's so important, is because it highlights the importance of the individual in international affairs. For those of you who have studied international relations at any point in your lives, we're told that it's structural factors, that it's institutions that really matter. But in fact, here we see evidence that individuals really do have an impact upon bilateral and international affairs. We see the importance that personality plays. We see the importance of the ability of an individual to marshal resources, to pull together coalitions, and to forge consensus. We also see here the importance of the historical record. This is a unique book in the sense that it pulls together all of these experiences from ambassadors stretching across a very long period of time in U.S.-Mexico bilateral relations. This book will stand for years afterwards as a resource that people can go to actually say, so what is it that the ambassadors were thinking when they were sitting there in Mexico City? Yes, I'm afraid. Without any further ado, I will turn over the microphone to Dolia Esteves. Dolia, congratulations on your book. Ambassadors, thank you so much for being here today. I'd like to make a special welcome as well to our audience that's watching on through the web. We'll be taking questions at the end of this session from the audience, and we'll also be taking questions from our Twitter audience. So please feel free to tweet away and send in your questions. anything that is actually repeatable, we will be using here. Many thanks.
I don't do anything.
Well, thank you so much, Duncan. That's very, very kind of you, that kind introduction. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here. I know it was raining and maybe we could have had a bigger turnout, but this is more than enough. And I want to start by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute in a very particular way. I started this project, or the idea of this project, back in 2010. I spoke to Andrew Seeley, who used to be the director of the Institute, and he immediately bought into, you say. He was excited, and we planned the research, and basically the Mexico Institute sponsored this project, which included research and traveling to first finding the ambassadors, because it wasn't that easy. I had a little bit of trouble finding Ambassador Nava, for instance, who lives in the middle of nowhere in a ranch outside San Diego, and he doesn't quite have a phone. Anyway, I spent a lot of time finding him. I finally found a reporter, a local reporter in a small town outside San Diego that gave me his email. And then the other ambassador that was not that easy to find was Ambassador Patrick Lucy, because in 2005 he moved to a senior's house because the wife has Alzheimer's and he lives there too. But nevertheless, I found him and I traveled to Milwaukee and interviewed him, and he's 93 years old. He's a very, very kind man. He was a governor of Wisconsin for several times, 2 times, I think. And he remembered a lot, but some things he didn't remember. But it was really a fun project for me. And I really want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Mexico Institute, the Andrew Seeley, Duncan, who came late to the project, but he's been very supportive in organizing this event. And of course, Eric Olson, who also was very helpful, and Miguel Salazar, and Allison Cordell, who were they're staff members of the Institute, and they were very, very helpful in, particularly by the end of the project, giving my manuscript, the editing, the design, and the printing. So I'm really thankful to all of them. Now, I'm more thankful to the ambassadors, the 3 ambassadors that we have here, and the 5 that are not here, for being very, very generous with their time and being very candid in their responses, patient with my questions, and obviously without that, this book would have never been coming out to the light. Now, I have a few words of introduction. Mexico has never been an easy place to be American ambassador due to the resentment that has long characterized U.S.-Mexico relations. The American envoy, by definition, is a polemical and sometimes mistrusted figure. He is the closest and most direct target on which to vent 200 years of historical frustration. Sometimes the sole presence can exacerbate anti-American sentiments and nourish popular conspiratorial theories of real or perceived intervention threats. Over the past decades, his arrival in Mexico, with few exceptions, has been preceded by a public drama or baptism of fire, as Ambassador Negroponte politely called the barrage of media attacks that new ambassadors are subject to when they arrive to Mexico. Paradoxically, all have been granted agreement, and 5 out of 9 of the last 9 ambassadors have been awarded the Orden of the Águila Azteca, Mexico's highest decoration given to a foreigner. Ultimately, the ambassador's success or failure is measured by the effectiveness with which he represents the United States and the trust he gains from the host nation. Now, why this book? Well, my journalistic coverage of U.S.-Mexico relations over 2 decades, from the NAFTA negotiations to the so-called war on drugs, discussions with key actors in both sides of the border, and reading thousands of pages of US diplomatic cables that I declassify under the Freedom of Information Act. This has nothing to do with WikiLeaks. I declassify them under FOIA. It takes a long time sometimes. I waited some of them 8 years. I'm still waiting for them, but that's the way to go. Provoked my interest in interviewing all living former ambassadors to Mexico about their own experiences. I was curious to hear their side of the story. But the event that finally impelled me to start the project was the political storm caused by the leaked diplomatic dispatches or cables that led to the abrupt resignation of Ambassador Pascual in 2011. This was a dramatic reminder that US ambassadorships to Mexico can still be a source of contention. The book we are launching today, which I think you will have, if not, there are many copies outside, brings together exclusive one-on-one in-depth interviews with 8 former living ambassadors to Mexico. And I was lucky enough to find them all continuously, from Patrick Lucy to Carlos Pascual in this 34-year period. Patrick Lucy, he was ambassador from 1977 to 1979. Julian Nava, he was ambassador from 1980 to 81. John A. Gavin, 1981 to 1986. John D. Negroponte, 1989 to 1993. James Jones, 1993 to 1997, Jeffrey Davido, 1998 to 2002, and Antonio Garza, 2002 to 2009, and Carlos Pascual, 2009 to 2011. For health reasons, I was unable to interview Ambassador Piliot. He was ambassador to Mexico from 1986 to 1989, but at the age of 94, he lives in an assisted living home in Ohio. The book includes, nevertheless, a summary describing his tenure in Mexico. These 9 ambassadors served under 3 Democratic and 3 Republican administrations or presidents. I conducted the interviews over a period of 9 months from April 2011 to January 2012 in Milwaukee, Los Angeles, La Jolla, Washington, D.C., and Mexico City. With each ambassador, I addressed specific issues, events, and individuals that marked his term in Mexico and the United States. Some spoke more candidly than others and with better recollection of the past than others. Each interview represents a chapter in the book, which includes an introduction explaining the political context in which they served, a brief biography, and key bilateral events that took place during their tenure. This collection of interviews constitutes the centerpiece of the book. It is therefore not an academic book, nor is it an attempt to assess the ambassador's performance or analyze U.S. foreign policy towards Mexico. It is rather an original work of journalism and tells the story of U.S.-Mexico relations over 34 years, from 1977 to 2011, from the unique perspective of these key actors that helped shape and influence the relationship. It is a forum to hear their voices and see Mexico through their eyes. The interviews offer insightful and colorful, hard-to-come-by insider anecdotes of some of the events that shaped U.S.-Mexico relations. They reveal confidential conversations about this often secretive and enigmatic relationship. Their testimonies show that the influence that ambassadors exerted in Washington's decision-making process and the political latitude they had were determined by their personal relationship with the United States President, the U.S. President's interest in Mexico, the political context of the time, and the ambassador's personality and political weight. They suggested that the White House pays more attention to Mexico in times of crisis like the revolt, the Zapatista revolt, the political assassinations of 1994, and the peso crisis in 1994 also. Or opportunities like the discovery of oil reserves in the 1970s and the NAFTA negotiations. And they confirmed that Mexico is not an easy place to be U.S. ambassador. In fact, all of them agree that it was one of the most, if not the most, challenging posts of their careers. A high-profile performance or being too vocal is not wise, but neither is being low-key or silent. Some say they try to demystify the Mexican public perception that U.S. ambassadors are proconsuls, sent to dictate policy and impose the U.S. agenda. Let me now introduce our first speaker, Ambassador John Negroponte. John Negroponte is a veteran career foreign service. He became ambassador to Mexico in 1989 as President Bush Sr. and Carlos Salinas de Gortari were beginning their respective terms. While in Mexico, Salinas was portrayed as an illegitimate president, and in the United States, he was embraced as a reform-minded president, committed to the transformation of Mexico from a nationalist, inward-looking country into a pragmatic, outreaching nation, as Ambassador said at the time. Key to this transformation was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Salinas asked Washington to negotiate soon after taking office. NAFTA became first President Bush's top policy priority, and Ambassador Negroponte was Washington's point man throughout the NAFTA negotiations, or the negotiation process. Negroponte remained as ambassador for the first 8 months of the Clinton administration, or the Clinton presidency, and left Mexico in September of 1993. Ambassador Negroponte considers NAFTA probably the most important accomplishment of his long public service career. Ambassador Negroponte, thank you very much for being here, and you have the
Thank you very much, Dolly. I appreciate it, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center and Duncan Wood for having brought us together this afternoon. And Dolia, thank you for the work you've done in the service you have performed in compiling this record of recollections by the various ambassadors. Maybe I could make a couple of general comments about ambassadorships in the first instance, because I think sometimes Mexicans in particular attribute to U.S. ambassadors some kind of unique characteristic that you only find in an ambassador to Mexico. But U.S. ambassadors confront some of the kinds of issues that you've described practically anywhere that they serve in the world, given the fact that we're a country with global responsibilities, that quite typically, I won't say always, but quite typically, the bilateral relationship that we have with any particular country is the most important bilateral relationship that they have. And so U.S. ambassadors tend to play a fairly significant role in just about any country that they serve. Obviously, there are variations on the theme. The second point I would make is that the baptism of fire, I think we have good company that goes back many decades. And I think particularly of somebody who's viewed very fondly in Mexico as perhaps one of the best, if not the best, United States ambassador to ever serve in Mexico, and that was Josephus Daniels, who was Franklin Roosevelt's ambassador. And there was an uproar when he was named because he had been the Secretary of the Navy when the United States invaded Veracruz in 1914. And so there was not exactly an automatically friendly association with Josephus Daniels down in Mexico, but Mr. Roosevelt insisted on his appointment, and Mr. Daniels went down there. He ended up being highly successful and managed to the particular liking of the Mexican government and people, the whole issue of the reaction to the nationalization of the oil fields in the late 1930s, for which he was well and fondly remembered. I met some very elderly people in Mexico when I went there who remembered their parents complaining about the fact that Josephus Daniels was a teetotaler. He's better remembered for that in the U.S. Navy because he's the person who banned drinking on U.S. naval vessels. But he also didn't serve liquor at his diplomatic receptions. And some people complained about that. But in any case, fast forward, I arrived there, I think, at a particularly propitious moment in the relationship. We had a Texan president, a Texan Secretary of State, a Texan Secretary of Commerce. For them, the U.S.-Mexico relations was something quite easy to comprehend. And then we had the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the emancipation of the various former Soviet republics. And President Salinas went to Davos in 1990 to the World Economic Forum, and he came back from that having concluded that, goodness, we're going to have to do something to compete for the world's savings and for the capital of the world, because all these new entities who've now gotten rid of communism want to play the sort of international free market game, if you will, are going to be highly competitive for these scarce capital resources. And therefore, and he conveyed this message to President Bush through Pepe Cordova, the chief of staff, and to me, and I took the message up to Washington. I think they'd probably pursued it in a couple of three different channels, but the idea of, well, what would the United States think of a free trade agreement? And that was 1990, and in a step-by-step fashion, we then ended up negotiating the agreement and concluding it by the end of 1992. So that was I think, a really strategic development in the United States-Mexico relationship. And I think it's had long-term impacts on the way the two countries see each other. And it's certainly had a major economic impact. The levels of trade and investment have tripled or quadrupled. They're up in the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year, making Mexico our second or third largest trading partner. So I think that was kind of a sea change in the United States-Mexico relationship. There were irritations, there were frustrations, but I don't know about what my colleague is going to say, but I find it very surprising if there's so much antagonism and so much frustration, why does practically every U.S. ambassador who come back from Mexico say that it was the greatest post they ever had in their lives? And also a lot of fun. It was a really enjoyable assignment. My family loved it. My children went to school there. My wife liked it. It was a great place to travel, which as an ambassador you get the opportunity to do. I visited 31 out of the 32 states. And it's one of my assignments, and I've had 10 or 11 overseas assignments in my career. It's one of the assignments where we have been able to maintain regular friendships with people we got to know there long after we left post. And I can't say that that's true of every other assignment that I've had in the Foreign Service. There's some countries where I barely have any kind of contact left. So yeah, it's complicated and it's challenging, there's no doubt about it, but it was also both very important and a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for those words. It was challenging. Mm-hmm. That was one of the one thing that common denominator that most of the ambassadors, or pretty much all the ambassadors I interviewed, said that it was the most challenging, but also the most fun, mm-hmm. and the one that indeed they remember the most. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you, Ambassador Negroponte. Now, Ambassador Jones. Ambassador Jones presented credentials as U.S. Ambassador to Mexico in September of 1993, months before what turned out to be one of the most chaotic years in Mexico financially and politically. That is 1994. Ambassador Jones had no previous diplomatic background, but with the reputation of a skilled politician, and maybe he did, I don't know. Did you? No. But with the reputation of a skilled politician and consensus builder, President Clinton offered him the chance to become his point man in Mexico because, as President Clinton said back then, NAFTA was in trouble. In 1994, three extraordinary events we had in Mexico, three extraordinary events: the Zapatista rebel uprising in Chiapas, the murder of the PRI presidential candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio in Tijuana, and the collapse of the peso. This forced Ambassador Jones into crisis management role. Aside from NAFTA, the one other instance in which Washington paid full attention to Mexico during Ambassador Jones' 3 years and 9 months tenure was the dramatic collapse of the peso at the end of 1994. Before becoming ambassador, Ambassador Jones had little interest in public service abroad, but he accepted Clinton's offer, which he now says turned out to be one of the most enjoyable and interesting jobs I ever had. That's a quote. Ambassador Jones, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Doya, for the book, for the interviews, and for what you shed light on this very important relationship. Like Ambassador Negroponte, Mexico does stay with you. I visited also, my wife and I, 31 of the 32 states. Campeche was not there because I was called back to Washington when we were going to Campeche for a particular consultation. But the other thing I would mention that Ambassador Negroponte said, the friendships that you make in Mexico, even though you're representing very strongly the views of the United States, are friendships that stay with you. I have had 2 other public service stints, 14 years in the U.S. Congress and 4 years at the White House. And in all of those positions, while you're in office, people hound you like crazy for favors, for opinions to be expressed, et cetera, et cetera. And the only instance in which the friendships that were made while you're in office stay after office was Mexico. The others, oftentimes it's hard to get people on the phone after you had one of these other experiences. Doya asked us to give 3 or 4 instances of the time we spent there that were most memorable, and there were several, as she just outlined, in that first year alone. But I think the thing that I recognized at the time President called me, I was in New York, head of the American Stock Exchange, and had been working with private sector to help negotiate and pass NAFTA and to create a climate where it could pass in the United States. And what was evident to me in that period of negotiating and pre-NAFTA passage was how important that was to our bilateral relationship. The fact that if we could create wealth where a majority of the people in both countries could benefit from that wealth, you have something worth defending in that relationship. And that was something that was very important to me. It was number one on the 6 objectives that I had when I went to Mexico. It was number 1 to try to help achieve and get past. The other thing that was evident from my first time to Mexico way back in 1966, I think it was, as a young staffer on President Johnson's staff that took the trip down with him to Mexico, was how this relationship had been very, very difficult over the years, and how it was changing by the 1980s, but how the resentment was still there in many parts of Mexico. So one of the things that I wanted to establish publicly when I first came there in the first press conference was that the era of paternalism, or the perception of paternalism by the United States toward Mexico, was over, and we had an era of partnership. And I reinforced that in all of my public press conferences or speeches or what have you. And that gave me the ability or the latitude to, in private, have very candid and sometimes complicated conversations with Mexican business and government leaders. And in those private conversations, you could get a whole lot of things done that you couldn't if you were publicly lecturing the Mexicans on what they ought to be doing from a U.S. perspective. The 3 or 4 things that I think were most interesting to me was first of all NAFTA. That was the reason that I was asked to go down there to help in the passage in the final negotiations of NAFTA. And that, to me, was the most important. What I tried to do when I got there was to have lots of communications with members of the Congress, the House and the Senate, who were my colleagues a few years before that when I was in Congress, and to tell them why it's in the best interest of the United States and why it's in the best interest of North American relationships. We were reasonably successful at that, but as we got down to the last month before the vote in the House, particularly on NAFTA, we were still several votes shy of having it passed. So I asked for what they call a whip list. Each party has a count of who's going to vote for, who's going to vote against, and who are truly undecided. So I asked for the list of the truly undecided members of the House. And there were 30 on that list who were not faking it yes or no, but truly undecided. So we organized 3 trips to Mexico, each week, 3 weeks prior to the vote, and had about 10 members of Congress on each of those trips. And we organized there an exposure not to the U.S. Embassy as much as to the Mexicans themselves, to the Mexican business leadership. We visited a Walmart, which they were surprised to see such modern retail conveniences and operations, to the very talented Mexican government officials, finance ministry, Pedro Aspe, to the Jaime Sarapuche, the commerce minister, et cetera, to the opposition parties, Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas of the PRD, the Panistas leadership, and they got a picture of Mexico. So I say among those 30 that we brought down to Mexico, 27, I think it was, 26 or 27 voted for NAFTA. Wow. Two others said they would stand behind the rail, and if we needed their votes, they would vote for us, but it was difficult in their districts. And I say that even though we tried to convince them that NAFTA was good for the United States, what really convinced them were the Mexican people themselves. And that exposure to the Mexican leadership was most important. So I think that was one of the things that, following on John Negroponte's building the foundation, was satisfying to me. Shortly after that, one of the other of the 6 objectives I had was to help Mexico truly achieve open, competitive, honest democracy. And the first chance at that were the 1994 elections, the presidential and congressional elections. And in that capacity, what we tried to do was to help the Mexicans who had already started this with their IFE Electoral Institute. We helped them by having groups such as the IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, come down many months prior to the '94 election to help them how they arrange an election, how they organize it, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the things that we tried to insist on privately, which was difficult at first, was to have international observers at the elections. As many of you know, the 1988 elections were quite controversial. I think probably the PRI, Salinas, won as far as real votes are concerned, but it clearly was not to the margin that they claimed to have won. And there was a lot of controversy about that election. So the '94 elections were very important. And in that capacity, we really tried to insist privately on the international observers. President Salinas balked at that. He didn't like the word international observers. And finally, we came up with some Kissinger-esque kind of title for these folks. But they arranged all over the world, many from the United States, both from the left and the right on political spectrum. And at the end of those elections, it was the first time, I believe, that the PRI president had won by less than 50% of the vote. And at the end of those elections, even though the PRD was putting a great deal of pressure on Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas to have demonstrations and revolt similar to what López Obrador did a few years later, he was convinced by the election observers that it was an honestly conducted election, and that I have great regard for him. He acted most responsibly and in the best interests of his country, even though he had to concede that he lost the election. So that was an important factor, which then led into the 1997 congressional elections, which were also honest and fair. And for the first time, the PRI lost the absolute majority in the Congress. And so from that set the stage for Vicente Fox and the opposition party to win for the first time in 71 years. So the democracy thing was very important. The Colosio assassination was difficult in a number of ways. Number one, to convince our country, our government, that this was indeed an aberration. This was not part of a plot, and we had a number of ways to be able to verify that. And it really was, we believe, the act of a deranged lone gunman. But that also caused a lot of problems for the stock market, the Bolsa. And one of the advantages of having that experience in the stock market in the United States was to be able to communicate to our financial markets what was really going on there, and that this was not anything that was any kind of a major destabilizing factor. And I was able to use that experience in that instance, in the Chiapas uprising, and then in the peso devaluation to help calm the markets and to keep Mexico's market from going too far awry. The peso devaluation was a difficult one. That literally, Mexico was within inches, if you will, of being bankrupt. And in the United States, there were two, in the White House even, there were two schools of thought. Those who were on the staff to protect President Clinton's political stature and not to put him in great political risks, and they basically wanted to wash their hands of the issue. And then there were those who saw this from a global point of view and recognized that if Mexico basically went bankrupt, it would go around the world to all other developed countries, then affect developing countries, and then affect developed countries, and come back and bite the United States very hard into our economy. And that could be a really global disaster on our hands. So I was going back and forth to Washington every Monday morning and coming back on Friday evening, working with Bob Rubin and Tim Geithner, and particularly Larry Summers, who took the lead on that, to try to craft a rescue package that then the Congress could pass. Problem is, the Congress was being almost as divided as it is today, and Newt Gingrich, who was the new Republican leader, and Dick Gephardt, the Democratic leader, could not agree on anything. There were difficulties on the Senate side, even within the Republican Party, Phil Gramm and Bob Dole, et cetera, et cetera. And so putting this package together and trying to get Congress in a position to ratify it was what I was doing for about a month there. It finally fell apart. We presented overnight a package, put a package together overnight. Larry Summers and I presented it to the president. Vice President Al Gore was the devil's advocate in trying to pick holes in our argument as to why the president should accept this package and do it unilaterally through an executive fund. And when we were finished, the president was just emphatic. He said, "We'll do it." And that's one of the times that usually Bill Clinton was very thoughtful, would weigh all sides of the issue, was not quite so decisive, and he was very decisive in that case. And it turned out to be good for Mexico. It diverted bankruptcy. It was good for the United States for the same reason, but also Mexico paid back the entire amount within 8 months, and I think we made about $800 million in interest on it. So it was a good
deal.
Yeah. So anyway, those were some of the. There were many more
Thanks.
that were really a great experience.
Well, thank you very much for that comprehensive summary of your 3 years, 9 months as ambassador to Mexico. You had your hands full. There was a lot going on at that time, big changing times. 1994 at one point looked like it was, the end. And one of the things that you tell me in the interview is that Washington was more nervous about Mexico than the embassy or you down there on the ground. That usually is the case, I suppose.
I think that's usually the case.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Jones. Now we turn to our last ambassador, and it's just chronological. It has nothing to do with, not even alphabetical order here. Let me see, Ambassador Jones. Oh, here.
David down.
Ambassador Davido.
So they forget so soon.
Thank you so much for flying all the way from California to be here.
No, I flew from Brazil to be
Oh,
here.
from Brazil. Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's even a longer flight.
Tell me.
Ambassador Davido became ambassador to Mexico in July 1998, 13 months after his predecessor had departed, that is Ambassador Jones. The Republican-controlled Senate refused to confirm President's first choice for the post, who was a political appointee. Governor from Massachusetts, Weld, some of you might remember him. And the White House took a long time to find a replacement. So as a result, I think this has been the longest time that we didn't have an ambassador in Mexico, 13 months. During his 4-year service in Mexico, Ambassador Davido witnessed Mexico's most dramatic change in recent history, which is the end of 71 years of one-party rule by the PRI and the election of the center-right pan-opposition candidate Vicente Fox to the presidency in the year 2000. One of the first things that President Fox did was ask Washington to negotiate, unquote, a comprehensive bilateral immigration agreement. But as we know now, there was no political will or desire in the Bush administration or in Congress to reform U.S. immigration laws to please the incoming Mexican president. As a result, in his last year in Mexico, Ambassador Davido witnessed the deterioration of the relationship between the two presidents, that is President Bush and President Fox, and the two countries. Fox and Bush drifted farther apart as Mexico, at that time, it was a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, refused to endorse U.S. plans to invade Iraq. In 2001, Ambassador Davido was asked by President Bush to remain in the post, making him one of 2 ambassadors, the other one is Ambassador Negroponte, to serve in 3 decades to have represented both Democratic and Republican presidents in Mexico. Ambassador Davido, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Dolly, and thank you for doing this book. I think this kind of oral history is important, not necessarily the words of any of the individual respondents, but I think it's important to build up a historical record that can be mined in later years by historians and academics. I was very, in a way, fortunate when I went to Mexico because my 2 predecessors, these 2 gentlemen, had really done a superb job. And I'm not just saying that because they're here. I don't think the people who followed me felt the same way, but that's their problem, not mine. I had a different experience than John and Jim, and I guess every ambassador has different experience, but I actually was ambassador twice in the following sense. For the first 2 years I was there, I represented the Democratic administration, Bill Clinton, before the pre-government. And in the last 2 years, I was representing the Republican administration of George Bush, hijo, and Vicente Fox. And really the issues that we were dealing with in the context were very different. Mm-hmm. Now, I think both John and Jim have made the point that really and this I don't think is that well understood, one of the major roles of an ambassador is really to serve as the interpreter and message carrier and hopefully part of the policy-making team in Washington, explaining what's going on in the country to which they're assigned. Everybody, I think, naturally thinks of an ambassador from, let's say, the United States in Mexico as the person who goes down and explains U.S. policy to Mexico, conveys important points, and that is true. But really, I think the American ambassador has a much more important role, in a way, to play in Washington. We saw that with John. It was John who brought and sold the concept of NAFTA to Washington. It was Jim who really, I think, was a stalwart especially during the peso crisis, in explaining to Washington that which perhaps the Mexican government itself could not do or could do, but with less credibility. In my case, I did not have necessarily issues as transcendental and as dramatic as NAFTA and the peso crisis, but nevertheless, almost on a daily basis, was interceding in favor of Mexico in Washington. Now, let me explain. I'll give you examples. Under the Clinton administration, the major issue in the relationship, not surprisingly, was the whole question of narcotics. And for those of you who may not recall, the issues relating to certification, the process by which the U.S. government would decide on a yearly basis whether foreign governments were doing enough to help in the fight against the narcotics trade to warrant our unilateral certification of those governments as being in the good guy category and therefore capable of receiving assistance and maintaining the best relations. This really formed the basis of so much of the relationship, not just with Mexico, but with other countries for many years. And I had been Assistant Secretary of State prior to going to Mexico, so I had been dealing with this, particularly with Colombia, Mexico as well. And what we had in particular, I think, in those last years of the Clinton administration, was a real division in Washington between those who wanted in some way or another to punish and decertify Mexico. That was the term, decertify. Mm-hmm. And those who realized that that would be a really stupid thing to do. It would have further clouded the relationship. It would have made the gaining the cooperation that we were gaining on the narcotics front even more difficult, and the level of cooperation would have gone down. Now, the difficulty was that this division was not only between elements of Congress, elements of the administration, but within the administration itself. And there were agencies of the U.S. government, and I have no problem talking here now, particularly the DEA, which had a animus towards Mexico that was quite strong. And a lot of that was historical, and those of you who remember the Camarena case. But it made maneuvering in Mexico, dealing with the Mexican government and explaining Mexico to Washington quite complicated, in that the adversaries of better relations with Mexico were not only the traditional adversaries within Mexico, people who were still fighting, getting up in the morning and looking for Henry Lane Wilson or Joel Poinsett, but the people in Washington who really were looking for ways to deal harshly with Mexico. And that required intercession, required a certain amount of care in what we reported, how we reported, who we talked to in Washington. And that was a challenge. Then we moved into a period of the elections of 2000. And that was a most exciting period of time, which then resulted in this tremendous change in Mexico in terms of the PAN taking over, and a new government which had great aspirations for its relationship with the U.S., a new government in Washington, and these aspirations were largely based on what I think was a very naive view by both President George Bush and Vicente Fox that the two of them working together could really resolve the immigration issue. And when they met just 6 weeks after Bush had taken office, and they met in Guanajuato, and they said, we're going to get this done, I really think they overestimated their abilities to manipulate their own political environments. Now, the general conventional wisdom is that 9/11 killed the possibility of immigration reform. I don't think that's the case. I think it was dead quite before then. Because after that meeting in February, and as committees formed, and as the Washington political establishment, and in this case I think it was particularly Karl Rove and the domestic political people, looked at the possibility of significant reform on migration issues, a decision was made that nothing could happen in the president's first term, or at least prior to the congressional elections of 2002. And what a relationship that had been characterized by euphoria in those first days turned sour by mid-2001. The way the Mexicans government baubled, mishandled 9/11, which was largely a rhetorical mistakes and symbolic mistakes, not necessarily substantive mistakes. That further made the relationship difficult. Plus, to be honest, I don't think the Fox government was as skillful in its management of many things, including the relationship with the U.S., as had been the previous government, which had had about 70 years of training in that. And so that made for a different environment. And then as we moved into the period of the Iraq War, things became quite sour. Now, I had left Mexico by that time.
Yeah.
But I remember having told Washington, and frankly, I never, even though I've read a great deal, I never really understood what our strategy in the United Nations was. We can talk about that.
That's a subject of
How
another
much
book.
time do you have?
Yeah, I don't know. What do you know? What do you know
Well, I
about my
was
health? I know you were, John. But the point I made was that there was really I left in, I guess, June. There was really very little possibility that Mexico was going to support us further in the United Nations unless it had the cover of countries, other countries, particularly France. And I didn't see that coming. And so the relationship got even more difficult. Nevertheless, by that time, and today, 10 years later, 11 years later, there is such a weight of continuity to the relationship, a weight that is carried by, right now, $500 billion worth of trade per year, by political factors in the United States that we're all aware of, that the relationship with Mexico for us and the relationship with us for Mexico is too big to fail. And that will continue. But for me, what was interesting was having to deal with three very different sets of context while I was there during those 4 years.
Mexico has sent very good ambassadors
Right.
to Washington. The last one being an outstanding example. Ambassador Petriccioli, who was the ambassador when I went to Mexico, had been finance secretary, and he had negotiated a lot of financial issues with Secretary of Treasury James Baker, so that when Baker became Secretary of State, he had full access to Mr. Baker whenever he needed it. So yes, it's a very important, and you can conspire with your fellow ambassador to get stuff done.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I hope you found this interesting. It was very interesting, very engaging.
Thank you.